In 1971, three friends opened a tiny coffee store in Seattle. They didn't sell lattes. They didn't sell cappuccinos. In fact, they didn't even sell coffee by the cup. And yet today, that small shop became Starbucks, a company worth billions. But here's the part most people don't know. The man who built Starbucks wasn't one of the founders. Seattle, 1971. It was the kind of gray morning Seattle was famous for. Low clouds hung over Elliott Bay and the air carried the smell of rain, mixed with salt from the ocean. Inside a small storefront at Pike Place Market, three men stood around a worn wooden counter. The place was quiet. Empty shelves lined the walls. On the table in front of them were a few small bags of coffee beans scattered like pieces of something valuable. Jerry Baldwin looked at them carefully, almost like they were treasure. Gordon Bowker leaned against the wall, a notebook resting in his hand. Zev Siegel paced slowly across the creaky floorboards. Opening a coffee shop in America in the early 1970s was a strange idea. Back then, most Americans didn't think much about coffee. They bought cheap coffee in metal cans. They scooped it into a machine in the kitchen, pressed a button, and that was it. The result was usually the same: bitter, flat, forgettable. Coffee wasn't something you enjoyed. It was just something you drank to wake up. But these three men had tasted something different, something richer, something deeper, real coffee. And once they experienced it, they couldn't forget it. A few years earlier, Jerry Baldwin had met a man who would quietly change everything. His name was Alfred Pete. Pete owned a tiny coffee shop in Berkeley, California. It wasn't flashy, no bright signs, no big crowds, just a small store filled with the deep, rich smell of freshly roasted coffee. But the way Pete treated coffee was different. To him, coffee wasn't just a drink. It was a craft, almost a ritual. He roasted the beans himself, slowly, carefully, watching every batch like a scientist running an experiment. When he talked about coffee, he sounded less like a shop owner and more like a wine expert describing rare grapes. Origins mattered. Roasting mattered. Flavor mattered. One afternoon, Jerry asked him a simple question. "What makes your coffee so different?" Pete looked at him for a moment before answering. "Because I respect the bean." Jerry laughed. "You're serious?" Pete didn't laugh back. Instead, he walked Jerry over to a large burlap sack sitting in the corner of the shop. He opened it and scooped a handful of green coffee beans into his palm. "These," he said, "are from Sumatra." Then he pointed to another sack. "And those from Ethiopia." Jerry watched as Pete handled the beans carefully, almost like they were something fragile. Then Pete said something Jerry would never forget. "Most people drink coffee to wake up." He paused. "I drink coffee to experience it." Pete brewed a fresh cup and handed it to him. Jerry took a sip. It was darker, richer, deeper than anything he had tasted before. In that moment, something shifted. Coffee was no longer just coffee. It was something else entirely. And Jerry realized something important. America had no idea what real coffee tasted like. But passion alone doesn't open a business. They didn't have much money. In fact, they had almost none. Each of the three men scraped together $1,350 of their own savings. It wasn't spare cash. It was the kind of money you save slowly, over years. Then they borrowed another $5,000. For them, that wasn't just an investment. It was a gamble. a real one. One evening, as they sat around a small table going over numbers, Gordon tried to lighten the mood. He leaned back in his chair and said, "If this fails, we'll all be eating ramen for the next 10 years. Jerry didn't even look up from the papers. "If this fails," he said quietly, "we'll be lucky if we can afford ramen." They laughed. But underneath the laughter, there was tension. Because they all knew the truth. Most small businesses fail. And opening a coffee store, one that didn't even sell coffee by the cup, sounded crazy to most people. Still, they kept going. They found a small space inside Pike Place Market, right in the heart of Seattle. The market was loud. Fishermen shouting prices, tourists walking shoulder to shoulder through narrow aisles. The smell of the ocean mixed with fresh fish, flowers, and bread from nearby bakeries. It was chaotic, alive. And right in the middle of all that noise, they began building something new. A tiny store dedicated to something most Americans barely thought about. Coffee. Before they could open the store, they needed a name. And naming a company is harder than it sounds. For days, the three of them sat around a small table throwing out ideas. Most of them were terrible. Some sounded like grocery brands. Others sounded like hardware stores. None of them felt right. One night, long after the market had closed, they were still there. Coffee cups everywhere. Scraps of paper covered with crossed-out names. Zev rubbed his eyes. "We're never going to figure this out." Gordon stared at one of the papers for a moment, thinking. Then he looked up. "You guys ever read Moby Dick?" Jerry frowned. "The whale book?" Zev laughed. "What does a giant whale have to do with coffee?" Gordon shrugged. "I don't know, but there's a character in the book. First mate on the ship. His name is Starbuck." The room went quiet for a second. Jerry repeated it slowly. "Starbuck." He rolled the word around in his head. Then he added something. "Starbucks." Another pause. This time it felt different. Gordon nodded slowly. "That actually sounds good." Zev smiled. "It sounds like it belongs on a harbor." Which made perfect sense. Seattle was a harbor city. Ships, sailors, stories from across the ocean. And suddenly the name felt like it had always been there, waiting. They looked at each other. No vote, no long debate. They just knew. The name had found them. Starbucks. And with that single word, a future global brand was born. The first Starbucks opened in 1971. A small store tucked inside Pike Place Market in Seattle. The sign outside was simple. Inside, the shelves were lined with bags of freshly roasted coffee beans. The air smelled incredible, rich, warm, and deep. But there was something unusual about this store. They didn't sell cups of coffee, no lattes, no cappuccinos, not even a simple cup of black coffee. Instead, they sold only three things: whole coffee beans, tea, and equipment for brewing coffee at home. To most Americans at the time, that sounded strange. The first customers walked in slowly, curious about the new shop. Some picked up bags of beans. Others just looked around, unsure what exactly they were supposed to buy. One man stepped up to the counter and asked the obvious question. "So, I can't get a cup of coffee here?" Jerry smiled and shook his head. "Nope." The man looked surprised. Jerry pointed to the beans on the shelf. "But you can take the best coffee beans in the world home with you." The customer stared at the bags for a moment. He looked confused, maybe even a little skeptical. For a second, it felt like the idea might be too strange, too different. But then, something interesting started happening. Some customers stayed, they asked questions. Where are the beans from? How do you brew them? Why do they smell so good? Jerry and the others explained everything. Patiently, passionately, slowly. Word began to spread. There was a new place in Seattle, a small shop that treated coffee like it actually mattered, and little by little, people started to notice. One afternoon, something happened that would change the future of the company. A young salesman named Howard Schultz walked into the store. At the time, Schultz worked for a company that sold coffee machines. His job was simple: travel, meet clients, sell equipment. But something about Starbucks had caught his attention. The small company was suddenly ordering an unusual number of coffee makers. So, Schultz decided to see the place for himself. When he stepped inside the shop, the smell hit him immediately. Freshly roasted coffee, rich, deep. Nothing like the coffee he was used to. Jerry Baldwin stood behind the counter. Howard picked up a cup of brewed coffee and took a sip. Then he froze, mid-sip. He lowered the cup slowly. "This is incredible," he said. Jerry smiled. "Glad you think so." Howard looked around the store again. Bags of beans from all over the world. Customers asking questions about flavor and origin. People talking about coffee like it actually mattered. It felt different. Howard asked another question. "Where do you get beans like this?" Jerry explained. He talked about their sourcing, their roasting methods, their obsession with quality. He talked about Ethiopia, Sumatra, Guatemala. Howard listened carefully. The more Jerry talked, the more fascinated Schultz became. Because in that moment, he realized something. Starbucks wasn't just selling coffee beans, it was sitting on something much bigger. Something the founders themselves hadn't fully imagined yet. Months passed, but Howard couldn't stop thinking about that store, about the smell of the coffee, about the potential. Finally, one evening, he picked up the phone and called them. Jerry answered. Howard didn't waste time. "I have a crazy idea," he said. Jerry paused. "What's that?" Howard took a breath. "I want to work for you." Howard Schultz joined Starbucks as director of marketing. At first, he did exactly what the founders expected. He promoted their beans, their roasting philosophy, their commitment to quality. But in 1983, something happened that changed everything. Howard traveled to Italy. The trip was supposed to be simple, just a chance to see how Europeans treated coffee. But what he discovered there completely changed his thinking. One morning in Milan, he walked into a small espresso bar. It wasn't fancy, just a narrow counter, a few small tables. But the place was full. People stood shoulder to shoulder. Some laughed. Others argued about politics. Friends greeted each other loudly. The barista moved quickly behind the counter, pulling shot after shot of espresso. Tiny porcelain cups slid across the bar. "Ciao! Buongiorno!" Coins clinked. Steam hissed from the espresso machine. The room was alive. Howard stepped up to the counter. The barista looked at him and smiled. "Espresso?" Howard nodded. A moment later, a tiny cup appeared in front of him. "Here you go." Howard took a sip. The flavor hit him instantly. Bold, rich, alive. But what struck him even more wasn't the coffee. It was the energy. The way people gathered. The conversations, the laughter. In Italy, coffee wasn't just a drink. It was a daily ritual, a place to meet, to talk, to connect. Howard stood there watching the room, and suddenly a thought crossed his mind, a powerful one. This, he thought, would work in America. Not just coffee beans, not just brewing at home, but a space where people could gather, where coffee was part of life, where a simple drink created a community. In that moment, standing in a crowded espresso bar in Milan, Howard Schultz saw the future, and it looked very different from the Starbucks that existed back in Seattle. Howard Schultz couldn't stop thinking about the espresso bars of Italy, the energy, the conversations. Back in Seattle, Starbucks still sold only beans and brewing equipment. But Howard realized something important. If Starbucks wouldn't build the coffeehouse dream, someone else would. One night, sitting alone in his office, the idea finally became clear. If Starbucks wouldn't build that future, he would, but that meant leaving the company and starting something risky. That night, he told his wife, "I think I need to start my own coffee company." She asked one simple question. "Do you believe in it?" "Yes." "Then you should try." Soon, Howard opened his own cafe inspired by the espresso bars of Milan. He called it Il Giornale. And it worked. People loved the energy. For the first time, Howard saw that his idea could work in America. Then, something unexpected happened. The founders of Starbucks decided to sell the company. Howard called investors. "We should buy Starbucks," he said. "How much?" $3.8 million. "That's a lot for a coffee company." Howard replied, "It won't just be a coffee company. It'll be a place between home and work, a place where life happens." In 1987, Howard Schultz bought Starbucks. He merged it with his cafes and began building something new. Not just a coffee company, a coffee culture. Stores changed. Soft music, comfortable chairs, friendly baristas, and drinks Americans barely knew. Latte, cappuccino, macchiato. People didn't just buy coffee, they stayed. Starbucks wasn't selling coffee anymore. It was selling a moment. And slowly, city by city, store by store, the company grew into a global brand. Today, Starbucks has thousands of stores worldwide. But it all started with 3 friends in a tiny shop inside Pike Place Market. Years later, a reporter asked Howard Schultz, "Did you ever imagine Starbucks becoming this big?" He smiled. "No." "Then what was the goal?" "I just wanted to build a place people loved." And sometimes, that's how the biggest companies begin, with a small idea and a really good cup of coffee. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more true stories about the companies, ideas, and people that change the world. Because behind every global brand, there's always a story nobody talks about.